Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're talking about stories, but maybe not just the kind you read at bedtime.
Right. We mean stories in the broadest sense. Analyst reports, scientific papers, professional communications.
Even things like indigenous knowledge passed down orally. Basically, any way information gets conveyed.
Exactly. And the big question we're tackling is, how do you know if any of these stories are actually trustworthy?
Yeah, how do we figure out what to rely on? In this deep dive, we're going to unpack that, drawing on some really interesting ideas about story elements.
We'll focus on the two key things that really build that sense of trustworthiness in any story.
And look, we know you want to get the important insights quickly without getting bogged down.
So our goal here is to give you a kind of framework, a way to cut through the noise and assess the stories you encounter.
Okay, let's get into it. First off, this idea of story structure.
Yeah, I mean, when we think story, we often imagine something with a clear beginning, middle, end, but lots of powerful ways of sharing knowledge don't have that.
Like you mentioned, oral traditions, or even think about a piece of art. It conveys something, right? But not in a neat, linear structure.
Absolutely. Indigenous Australian knowledge, for instance, passed down for generations, incredibly valuable, vital information, but not in a, report format.
Then you contrast that with the professional world. Analyst reports, official documents.
Those tend to follow expected patterns, accepted logical structures, the who, what, when, where, why, how.
We sort of expect that framework.
And interestingly, when we see that structure, especially in a formal setting, we often don't or maybe can't check every single detail ourselves.
Right. Who has the time?
Exactly. So we tend to rely on the fact that it looks right, that it uses these accepted ways of presenting information. The source calls them constructs.
So the structure itself becomes a shortcut for judging credibility.
In a way, yes. We're using these familiar constructs to evaluate the information within the construct. It's like judging a book by its cover, but maybe a more sophisticated version.
Which, I guess, leads us to trust in larger systems.
Right.
How else could we function with all the information thrown at us?
That's a crucial point. Think about academia or science. We largely have to trust the systems in place.
Like peer review.
Peer review, the reputation of scientific journals, university accreditation. We trust that these systems do some vetting for us.
Because we can't possibly replicate every experiment or read every background paper.
It's just not practical. So there's an inherent level of trust built into how we access and use specialized knowledge.
It's a necessary shortcut. And the source draws a really interesting parallel here about how stories become accepted just through repetition.
Oh yeah, this is fascinating. A story, repeated often enough, can become seen as truth, or at least accepted practice, in really different contexts.
How so?
Well, in business, a certain way of doing things, if repeated enough times, might become best practice.
Even if there wasn't, rigorous data proving it initially.
Sometimes, yes. And in a community setting, that same process of repetition might solidify something as tradition, or maybe even superstition.
Huh. So the underlying mechanism, repetition leading to acceptance, is kind of the same.
Our source argues it's scientifically identical, but we often treat them differently, right? A business best practice might sound more legitimate than a local tradition.
Even though both might have just emerged from being told and retold. Interesting. Okay, so let's get to the core. How do we actually judge trustworthiness? The source gives us two main concepts.
Validity and reliability. These are the two key lenses.
Okay, let's break those down. Validity first. What's that about?
Validity is essentially about believability. Does this story make sense? Does it align with other things we already accept or know to be true?
So it's like a check against our existing knowledge base.
Exactly. And importantly, validity isn't just a yes-no thing. It gets stronger the more widely the story aligns with other accepted ideas or constructs.
It's about consensus, in a way.
Yes, comparison and consensus. Does it fit the picture we already have? That's the essence of validity.
Okay, makes sense. Believability based on comparison. What about reliability?
Reliability is different. It's about consistency and reproducibility.
Can you get the same result again?
Pretty much. If someone else followed the same process or looked at the same data under similar conditions, would they arrive at the same story, the same conclusion?
Or has this story been reported consistently across different sources?
Yes, that too. The more times it's reproduced and the more similar those reproductions are, the higher the reliability.
Got it. Validity, believability, reliability, consistency.
You've got it.
Yeah.
And it's the combination of these two that really shapes how we perceive the trustworthiness of a story.
Okay, so how did that combination play out?
Well, the ideal scenario is high validity and high reliability.
So it seems believable and it's consistently reported or reproduced.
Exactly. When you have both, we tend to label that story as credible, trustworthy. We think of it as true, correct, right?
That's the gold standard then. But what if they don't align? Like high validity, but low reliability.
Okay. So if it seems plausible, it makes sense intuitively, high validity, but it hasn't really been tested much, or the results are inconsistent, low reliability.
What's that?
That's basically a hypothesis. It's an idea that seems promising, but needs more evidence, more testing to see if it holds up consistently.
Okay, a hypothesis. Now what about the other way around? Low validity, but high reliability.
This is an interesting one. Something is happening consistently, high reliability, but we don't really understand why, or it doesn't fit with our current understanding. Low validity.
Huh. What would be an example?
Think maybe of certain folk remedies that seem to work consistently for some people, but science can't explain why. Or maybe a business strategy that yields consistent results, but the underlying reasons aren't clear.
So what do we call that?
Often, this falls into the category of faith or belief. We accept it happens because we see it happening reliably, even if we lack a believable explanation for it.
Right. We trust the consistent outcome, even without understanding the why.
Precisely. And then the last category.
Low validity and low reliability.
Yeah, it doesn't seem believable, and it's not consistently reported or reproduced. Our source suggests this bucket often holds things we label either as theory.
Theory. I thought theory was more established.
Well, here, theory is used more in the sense of something speculative, something that might be verifiable in the future, but currently lacks both strong evidence and clear alignment with what we know. Think maybe of some cutting-edge, unproven scientific ideas.
Okay, so potential, but not there yet. And the other label?
Or it's just plain distrusted. Seen as unreasonable, inconceivable, wrong, false. Conspiracy theories with no evidence would fit here.
So both theory in this sense and distrusted are stories failing on both counts. But theory maybe implies some hope of future proof.
That seems to be the implication, yes. It hasn't yet satisfied the criteria.
This framework is really useful. Now, you mentioned earlier how structure can influence belief.
Yes, and the source makes a really good point about the power of well-organized stories, especially from seemingly credible sources.
How so?
If someone, say, an academic from a well-known university, presents information very clearly, very logically structured.
We tend to believe it more.
Often, yes. Even if we have no firsthand experience with the topic, the perceived competence in how the story is told lends authority to the content of the story.
It feels more professional, more trustworthy.
Right. Which leads to a good question the source raises for all of us. When do we decide to scrutinize a story more carefully?
Yeah, why do we sometimes just accept things and other times really pick them apart, even if it's about a similar topic?
What flips that switch from acceptance to skepticism? It's a really interesting behavioral question.
And thinking about this leads into another point, the different priorities sometimes between science and professional practice.
Yes, the source highlights a potential tension here. It suggests that, generally speaking, science often prioritizes establishing validity first.
Finding that believable cause and effect, the why.
Exactly. With the hope, or aim, that reliability, consistent results will follow once the mechanism is understood and tested further.
Okay, science starts with, is it believable?
Often, yes. But in professional practice, say, in business or industry, the emphasis is frequently on reliability first.
Doing things consistently, following procedures.
Right. Applying established methods reliably, often with an underlying presumption that those methods are valid, that they actually work as intended.
Ah, I see. So one starts with why and hopes for consistency. The other starts with consistency and often assumes the why.
That's a good way to put it. And this difference can lead to what the source calls the theory-practice gap.
Could you give an example?
Sure, safety management is a good one. Industry often focuses heavily on rule compliance, ensuring everyone follows the procedures consistently. High reliability of following rules.
Okay, and the assumption is?
The assumption, often implicit, is that high compliance, reliability, automatically leads to safety, validity.
But academics might question that.
Yes, researchers might say, hold on, just because people follow the rules doesn't guarantee safety in every dynamic, complex situation. They'd argue the validity of that direct link needs empirical proof.
They want to see the evidence that rule following causes safety, not just correlates with it sometimes.
Exactly. They might even argue that rigidly following rules could be invalid in some unexpected situations where flexibility is needed.
But I bet the industry folks push back too.
Oh, absolutely. Practitioners often question if academic studies done maybe in controlled settings or with small groups are truly valid for the messy real world.
Does that lab result really apply on the factory floor kind of thing?
Precisely. They question the real-world applicability, the external validity of the research. So both sides raise valid points about the other's focus.
It really highlights the need for bridging that gap. The source mentioned researchers in industry and practitioners doing research, which sounds promising.
It's definitely a positive trend. Fostering that crossover is key.
Okay, so we've talked about validity and reliability of the story itself, but the source adds another layer.
Yes, it distinguishes between the content story, the actual information being conveyed, and the source story, which is about the sender of the information.
So who is telling the story matters just as much.
Critically, overall trustworthiness, the source argues, depends on the validity and reliability of both the content and the source.
And the source story's validity and reliability, is that basically reputation?
That's exactly what it boils down to. A source's reputation is built on perceptions of their past believability and consistency.
So if a source has a strong reputation like a trusted news outlet or a respected expert,
We might accept their content story more readily, sometimes even without scrutinizing it too closely, because we trust the source story.
but someone else might focus purely on the content, does this specific piece of information seem valid and reliable, regardless of who said it?
Yes. And sometimes people might even accept information they find a bit questionable, low content validity, simply because it comes from a highly trusted source. High source validity reliability, maybe planning to check it later.
Okay, so there's an interplay between trust in the message and trust in the messenger.
Definitely. And the source proposes a simple conceptual model to think about this. It's not a strict calculation, but a way to visualize it.
How does that work?
It uses a scale, conceptually, from 0 to 4. You consider both the validity and reliability of the content and the validity and reliability of the source.
And a 4 would be the highest potential trustworthiness.
Right. High validity and reliability for both content and source. Again, it's a thinking tool, not a precise measurement tool.
Because context matters hugely. Right?
Absolutely critical. Trustworthiness isn't fixed. It depends on the specific situation, the topic, the time.
Like the example given a brilliant biologist isn't automatically a credible source on, say, bridge construction.
Exactly. Their source validity is high in biology, but low in engineering. Context is everything. Expertise is specific.
So this 0-4 scale helps us conceptualize the factors, but in real life.
In real life, the source argues, trustworthiness often works more like a binary switch. It's a YS or a NO for a specific purpose in a specific context.
Not so much, I trust this 75%, but more like, do I trust this enough to act on it right now?
Precisely. The example given is quite useful, saying something like, look, I generally trust your expertise, valid, reliable source, but this specific statement doesn't make sense to me, invalid content, even if your results are usually consistent, reliable content.
That's much more practical than just a number. It tells you where the doubt lies.
Exactly. It pinpoints the issue.
Okay, so assessing this validity and reliability, what makes it tricky, especially with certain kinds of information?
Well, for things we can directly observe, the source calls this material energy, like physical phenomena.
Things we can see, touch, measure easily.
Right. Validity often comes from shared sensory experience. We all feel the heat, see the thermometer rise. Reliability comes from seeing it happen repeatedly, consistently under the same conditions. Others can observe it too.
Shared experience, repeatable results. Relatively straightforward.
Relatively, yes. But it gets much harder with what the source terms immaterial energy.
Things like
Concepts we can't directly observe. Think organizational culture, risk appetite, employee morale, brand reputation.
abstract ideas.
Exactly. How do you directly observe culture? You can observe behaviors associated with it, but the concept itself is intangible.
Which makes validity hard to agree on.
Very hard. Does everyone even mean the same thing when they say culture? If there's no agreed upon meaning, how can you validate claims about it?
And reliability is tough too then, if you can't clearly define and observe it.
It's hard to measure it consistently or have others replicate your assessment reliably.
Yep.
You run into subjectivity.
And the source mentions these abstract concepts can sometimes prop each other up.
Yes, that's a key problem. You might hear, our risk appetite is low because of our conservative culture, and also our culture is conservative because we have a low risk appetite.
It's circular reasoning, Neither concept is independently verified.
Exactly. Attempts are made to link them to observables, like surveys about culture correlated with observed safety incidents, for instance.
But there are limitations.
Big limitations. Survey scores are subjective, and consistency in scores, reliability, doesn't automatically mean the survey is accurately capturing the underlying concept, validity, or that everyone interprets the scores the same way.
So relying on these fuzzy, abstract terms as explanations can be problematic.
Very much so, especially in professional contexts, where they're sometimes used as definitive causal explanations without solid backing.
It comes back to that earlier point. High reliability, like consistent survey scores, without clear validity doesn't equal truth.
Right. It might just be consistently measuring something, but maybe not what you think you're measuring. It can be closer to faith or belief if the validity isn't established. Validity needs that shared, agreed-upon meaning. Reliability needs repeatability based on that meaning.
Okay, this has been a really insightful breakdown. Let's try and summarize the main takeaway for listeners navigating all the stories out there.
I think the core message is, whenever you encounter information, a report, an article, advice, anything, consciously think about both its believability, its validity,
Does it make sense? Does it fit with other credible information?
and its consistency, its reliability.
Yeah.
Has it been reproduced? Is it consistently reported?
And don't forget the source.
Crucially, yes, assess the validity and reliability of the source as well as the content, and always consider the specific context. Is this source credible on this topic?
It's a multifaceted check then. Believability and consistency for both the message and the messenger within context.
If you keep those elements in mind, you have a much stronger framework for judging trustworthiness and making informed decisions.
It really moves beyond just a gut feeling or how often you've heard something.
Absolutely. It encourages a more critical, analytical approach to information.
Excellent. So for our final thought today, something for you, our listeners, to mull over.
Think about a piece of news or maybe some advice you got recently, using this lens of validity and reliability for both the content and the source. How does it stack up?
What assumptions did you perhaps make initially about its trustworthiness? Maybe based just on the source or just on how plausible it sounded?
Try applying this framework consciously to the information you encounter day to day. It can be quite revealing.
A great exercise. Thanks so much for walking us through this.
My pleasure. It's a vital skill in today's world.
Indeed it is. Thanks everyone for taking this deep dive with us.